Listen carefully, France and UN. I just caught your mercenaries wearing UN uniforms, and now we're preparing consequences for their actions. And from the pain of civilians you attacked rises African fury that will pursue you. You thought blue helmets would hide your operatives. You believed we were too stupid to recognize French soldiers attacking and harming our women while you stayed safe. You were wrong. This is your final warning before accountability. Remove your mercenary army, or we're bringing them to justice and holding them accountable. Your UN cover is shredded. Let me show you exactly how I discovered France was using UN peacekeeping missions to hide military operations. I was reviewing security reports from our northern border when something caught my attention. Our intelligence officers reported unusual activity around a UN peacekeeping base near the Mali-Burkina Faso border. The UN force was officially from France, deployed under a Security Council mandate to support regional stability. But our officers noticed the peacekeepers were conducting military operations that had nothing to do with peacekeeping. The UN peacekeepers were leaving their base at night in unmarked vehicles. They were traveling to villages where armed groups operated. They were engaging in combat operations. They were returning with casualties. This wasn't peacekeeping, this was warfare. But they were doing it under UN cover, wearing blue helmets and flying UN flags. I ordered increased surveillance of the UN base. I wanted to know exactly what these peacekeepers were doing. I deployed intelligence officers to monitor their movements. I installed hidden cameras along routes they traveled. I recruited informants in villages they visited. I built comprehensive surveillance of their operations. The footage we gathered over 3 weeks was shocking. The UN peacekeepers were conducting targeted operations against local leaders who opposed French interests. They were attacking armed groups that threatened French mining operations. They were protecting French corporate facilities. They were gathering intelligence on Burkinabe military positions. They were conducting military operations serving French interests, not UN peacekeeping mandates. But the most damning evidence came from a raid they conducted on a village 15 kilometers inside Burkina Faso territory. Our cameras captured the entire operation. 20 UN peacekeepers in blue helmets crossed our border at 2 a.m. They surrounded a house where a local resistance leader lived. They broke down the door. They dragged out the leader, his wife, and 3 children. They shot all 5 in the street. They burned the house. They left. The footage was crystal clear. We had their faces. We had their vehicles. We had their weapons. We had them shooting civilians, including children. We had them committing war crimes on Burkinabe soil while wearing UN uniforms. The evidence was undeniable. I ordered my intelligence team to identify the perpetrators. We ran facial recognition on the footage. We cross-referenced with databases of French military personnel. We found matches. The UN peacekeepers were actually French Foreign Legion soldiers. They were elite French military units operating under UN cover. We identified 23 of the 20 soldiers in the raid. All were active-duty French military. Their commander was a French colonel with 20 years of service. His deputy was a French major who had served in Afghanistan and Syria. The soldiers were French special forces with extensive combat experience. These weren't peacekeepers. They were professional soldiers conducting unauthorized operations. I also discovered that France had been using this tactic systematically. They deployed French military units to UN peacekeeping missions across Africa. The soldiers wore UN uniforms and carried UN credentials, but they took orders from French military command, not UN headquarters. They conducted operations serving French interests, not UN mandates. The entire peacekeeping presence was a fraud. I calculated the scope of the deception. France had 4,500 soldiers deployed in UN peacekeeping missions across Africa. These soldiers were officially under UN command, but our investigation revealed that 3,200 of them were actually French military operating under UN cover. They conducted operations in Mali, Central African Republic, Chad, Niger, and Democratic Republic of Congo. They protected French interests while pretending to keep peace. The UN was either complicit in this fraud or incompetent for not detecting it. Either way, the UN peacekeeping system was completely compromised. France was using UN missions as cover for military operations. They were committing war crimes under UN protection. They were violating the sovereignty of African countries under the guise of peacekeeping. The entire system was corrupt. I decided to expose this publicly and immediately. I would broadcast the border footage showing French mercenaries shooting civilians. I would present the evidence identifying them as French military. I would demand that France withdraw all forces from UN missions. I would call for ending all UN peacekeeping in Africa. I would destroy France's credibility and the UN's legitimacy. I called a press conference and invited media from around the world. I said I had evidence of French war crimes committed under UN cover. I said the footage would shock people. I said it would prove that UN peacekeeping was a fraud. The announcement generated enormous interest. Media from 67 countries attended the press conference. I started by explaining the context. France had deployed soldiers to UN peacekeeping missions, claiming to support African stability, but these soldiers were actually protecting French economic interests and conducting military operations against anyone who challenged France. They were mercenaries disguised as peacekeepers. Then I played the footage. The screens showed French soldiers in UN uniforms crossing into Burkina Faso. They showed the soldiers surrounding the house. They showed them dragging out the family. They showed the shooting of 5 people, including 3 children. They showed the soldiers burning the house and leaving. The footage was graphic and undeniable. The room went silent. Journalists stared at the screens in horror. They were watching UN peacekeepers commit serious crimes. They were seeing war crimes committed under UN protection. They were witnessing the corruption of the entire peacekeeping system. The shock was visible on every face. I continued presenting evidence. I showed the facial recognition results identifying the soldiers as French military. I displayed their military records proving they were active-duty French forces. I presented communications intercepts showing they took orders from French command. I proved conclusively that these weren't rogue soldiers. This was official French military operation under UN cover. I also presented evidence of similar operations across Africa. French forces in Mali had targeted 67 local leaders opposing French mining interests. French forces in Central African Republic had attacked villages supporting anti-French armed groups, resulting in 234 civilian deaths. French forces in Chad had conducted raids into Niger and Sudan, serving French strategic interests. The war crimes were systematic and widespread. I demanded immediate action. France must withdraw all military personnel from UN peacekeeping missions immediately. The UN must investigate French abuse of peacekeeping cover. The International Criminal Court must prosecute French commanders for war crimes. African countries must expel all UN peacekeeping forces that might be compromised by French infiltration. The press conference generated global outrage. The footage of French soldiers shooting children was broadcast worldwide. Human rights organizations condemned France. African governments demanded explanations. The UN faced calls to investigate. France was in crisis as their deception was exposed to the world. France initially denied everything. Their foreign ministry claimed the footage was fabricated. They said France would never commit such crimes. They accused me of spreading propaganda to damage French-African relations. They tried to dismiss the evidence as lies, but I had anticipated this. I released additional evidence that made denial impossible. I provided the names and military records of all 23 identified soldiers. I shared communications intercepts with timestamps and voice analysis proving authenticity. I offered to provide DNA evidence from the crime scene matching the identified soldiers. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. France's denial collapsed within 48 hours. International forensic experts verified the footage was authentic. Military analysts confirmed the soldiers were French forces. Intelligence agencies in multiple countries corroborated the communications intercepts. France couldn't maintain the lies. They were forced to admit their soldiers had been involved, but France tried to claim it was unauthorized action by rogue soldiers. They said the soldiers had acted without orders. They promised to investigate and punish those responsible. They tried to portray this as isolated incident rather than systematic policy. They were still lying to minimize the scandal. I destroyed this narrative by releasing orders from French military command. The orders explicitly directed the raid on the village. They identified the target by name. They authorized lethal force. They instructed soldiers to wear UN uniforms to avoid attribution to France. The orders proved this was official French military operation, not rogue action. The orders came from a French general commanding French forces in the Sahel region. He reported directly to the French Ministry of Defense. The operation was approved at the highest levels of French military and government. This wasn't rogue soldiers. This was French state policy to use UN peacekeeping as cover for war crimes. Listen carefully. France and the United Nations. Remember when you thought blue helmets would hide your operatives? Remember when you believed we'd never catch your mercenaries harming our people? Remember when you assumed Africans were too weak to expose your crimes? I shattered every assumption. I caught your mercenaries on camera. I identified them as French military. I broadcast their war crimes to the world. Your denials collapsed. Your cover is blown. Your peacekeeping fraud is exposed to everyone. The exposure triggered immediate consequences. African countries demanded emergency UN Security Council meetings to address French abuse of peacekeeping. The African Union called for withdrawal of all French forces from UN missions. Human rights organizations filed complaints with the International Criminal Court. France faced diplomatic isolation and criminal investigations. Several African countries took unilateral action. Mali immediately expelled all UN peacekeepers, saying they couldn't trust any forces that might include French mercenaries. Central African Republic demanded that France withdraw its soldiers from the UN mission there within 30 days. Chad suspended cooperation with UN peacekeeping operations. Niger refused to allow any new UN deployments. The trust in UN peacekeeping collapsed. The UN Secretary-General ordered an investigation into French forces in peacekeeping missions. The investigation confirmed that 3,200 of 4,500 French peacekeepers were actually military operatives taking orders from French command, not UN headquarters. The investigators found evidence of 340 operations conducted by these forces that violated UN peacekeeping mandates and international law. The investigation revealed that France had systematically infiltrated UN peacekeeping missions for 15 years. They volunteered large numbers of soldiers for UN missions, knowing the UN desperately needed troops. Once deployed, French commanders maintained parallel command structures. Soldiers wore UN uniforms but followed French orders. They conducted French military operations under UN cover. The deception was comprehensive and long-running. The UN investigation also found that some UN officials knew about or suspected the French infiltration, but did nothing. They were afraid of losing French troop contributions if they challenged France. They prioritized maintaining French participation over enforcing UN rules. Their complicity enabled French war crimes. The UN system was corrupt from top to bottom. The International Criminal Court opened investigations into French commanders and soldiers. They examined evidence of 67 targeted operations in Mali, 234 civilian deaths in Central African Republic, and numerous other war crimes across Africa. They issued arrest warrants for 12 French officers, including 2 generals. France refused to surrender them, claiming they were following orders and acting in French national interest. France's refusal to cooperate with the ICC destroyed what remained of their credibility. Countries that had defended France now criticized them. The European Union issued statements condemning French actions. America distanced itself from France. France was isolated internationally as a war criminal state that used UN peacekeeping as cover for atrocities. I calculated the total damage to French interests from the exposure. France lost all remaining credibility in Africa. African countries canceled $67 billion in contracts with French companies. France lost access to African resources worth $89 billion annually. French military was expelled from 7 African countries. French diplomatic influence collapsed as African countries refused to cooperate with France. The total cost exceeded $200 billion over 5 years. But the damage went beyond France. The UN peacekeeping system lost all legitimacy in Africa. African countries recognized that UN missions could be covers for foreign military operations. They couldn't trust that peacekeepers were actually keeping peace rather than serving foreign interests. The entire concept of UN peacekeeping was discredited. By 2027, 28 African countries had expelled or refused UN peacekeeping forces. They said they would handle security themselves or through regional African organizations. They would never again allow foreign troops on their soil under any pretext. The UN peacekeeping missions that had operated in Africa for 60 years were ending. The expulsion of UN peacekeepers had mixed effects. In some countries, security improved as the fake peacekeepers who were actually causing problems left. In other countries, armed groups expanded as genuine security forces departed. But all countries agreed that sovereignty was more important than foreign military presence, regardless of the security trade-offs. African countries also recognized they needed alternatives to UN peacekeeping. We couldn't just expel foreign forces without building our own security capacity. We needed strong African militaries and regional security cooperation. We needed to provide the security that UN peacekeeping had claimed to provide, but actually undermined. I worked with other African leaders to build these alternatives. We expanded the African Union's peacekeeping capabilities from 25,000 to 89,000 soldiers. We increased funding from $890 million to $3.4 billion annually. We established rapid response forces that could deploy within 48 hours to any crisis. We built African security capacity that didn't depend on foreign troops. We also established strict rules preventing future infiltration. Any African peacekeeping forces had to be commanded by African officers. All operations had to be approved by African Union headquarters. All soldiers had to be from African countries with no foreign military connections. Communications and intelligence had to be handled by African systems. We built security against the infiltration tactics France had used. The African peacekeeping forces proved more effective than UN forces had been. They understood local context better. They spoke local languages. They weren't pursuing foreign agendas. They actually kept peace instead of conducting covert military operations. The success validated the decision to expel UN forces and build African alternatives. But I also recognize that exposing French mercenaries in UN peacekeeping had broader implications. It revealed that Western countries were willing to abuse any international system to serve their interests. They would corrupt peacekeeping, humanitarian operations, development programs, or any other system if it gave them cover for their activities. African countries needed to be vigilant about all foreign presence. I studied the history of UN peacekeeping in Africa to understand how France had corrupted it. UN peacekeeping began in the 1960s with genuine intentions to prevent conflicts and protect civilians. But Western countries quickly recognized they could use peacekeeping missions to maintain influence in former colonies. They volunteered troops not to keep peace, but to protect their interests. France had been particularly aggressive in using peacekeeping for military operations. They had deployed to 23 African countries under UN mandates. In each deployment, they protected French economic interests, gathered intelligence on African governments, and conducted operations against anyone who challenged France. The peacekeeping cover gave them access and legitimacy they couldn't get through direct military presence. The corruption of peacekeeping had caused enormous harm. French forces had harmed thousands of Africans while pretending to protect them. They had destabilized countries while claiming to stabilize them. They had violated sovereignty while pretending to respect it. The harm from fake peacekeeping exceeded any good that genuine peacekeeping might have done. By exposing this corruption, I was ending a 60-year system of Western military presence disguised as peacekeeping. African countries would no longer accept foreign troops under any pretext. We would build our own security capacity and handle our own problems. We would achieve real sovereignty instead of accepting foreign military presence disguised as help. I calculated what Africa would look like in 2030 with all UN peacekeeping expelled and African security systems fully operational. We would have 89,000 African Union peacekeepers providing genuine security. We would have regional forces in West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, totaling 45,000 soldiers. We would have national militaries strengthened to 1,200,000 total soldiers across 54 countries. We would have comprehensive African security capacity. The security capacity would be funded by African governments contributing 2.5% of GDP to defense and security. With total African GDP of $3.2 trillion in 2030, this would generate $80 billion annually for security spending. This was sufficient to maintain strong militaries, peacekeeping forces, and security systems. We wouldn't need foreign military presence or assistance. The African security forces would be more effective than foreign forces had been. They would understand local contexts and speak local languages. They would have genuine interest in African stability rather than foreign agendas. They would be accountable to African governments and people. They would provide real security instead of serving as covers for foreign military operations. But building this capacity required time and resources. In the short term, expelling UN peacekeepers created security gaps. Some armed groups expanded their operations, some conflicts intensified, some civilians suffered. The transition from foreign to African security provision was difficult and costly. I argued that the short-term costs were worth the long-term benefits. We had to accept some temporary instability to achieve permanent sovereignty. We had to build our own capacity, even if it meant struggling initially. We had to endure the transition period to reach the goal of complete security independence. The alternative was accepting permanent foreign military presence that would never truly serve our interests. Other African leaders agreed. They recognized that sovereignty required accepting short-term costs for long-term gains. They committed resources to building African security capacity. They supported each other during the difficult transition. They maintained unity in refusing to allow foreign troops back, regardless of security challenges. By 2029, the transition was largely complete. African Union peacekeepers were operating in 12 countries, providing genuine security. Regional forces were handling conflicts in their areas. National militaries were strong enough to maintain internal security. The security gaps from expelling UN forces had been filled by African forces. We had achieved security sovereignty. The success proved that African countries could provide their own security without foreign military presence. We didn't need UN peacekeepers, who were actually foreign mercenaries. We didn't need foreign bases that served foreign interests. We didn't need foreign military assistance that came with strings attached. We could defend ourselves and keep peace ourselves. The proof came from measurable results across the 28 countries that had expelled UN peacekeepers and built African security capacity. These countries had replaced foreign forces with African Union peacekeepers, regional forces, and strengthened national militaries. The transition had been completed by 2029, and the results were clear and undeniable. Security indicators improved in 23 of 28 countries after expelling UN peacekeepers. Armed conflict decreased by average 34% as African forces understood local contexts better and didn't pursue foreign agendas. Terrorist attacks dropped by 41% as African intelligence networks were more effective than foreign systems. Cross-border incursions stopped completely as African regional cooperation secured borders. The security improvements validated the decision to expel foreign forces. The 5 countries where security initially worsened after expelling UN peacekeepers were Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, and Mali. These countries faced particularly severe conflicts with multiple armed groups and weak state capacity. The transition from UN to African forces was difficult because the security challenges were so complex. But even in these 5 countries, security stabilized within 18 months as African forces adapted and strengthened. By 2029, all 5 had achieved security levels equal to or better than under UN peacekeeping. The temporary difficulties during transition didn't invalidate the long-term benefits of African security sovereignty. The key difference was that African forces were accountable to African governments and people, not to foreign powers. When African peacekeepers committed abuses, they faced consequences. When UN peacekeepers had committed abuses, they had diplomatic immunity and escaped justice. The accountability made African forces more disciplined and effective. African forces also had greater legitimacy in communities. Local populations trusted African soldiers who looked like them, spoke their languages, and understood their cultures. They had viewed UN peacekeepers as foreign occupiers serving foreign interests. The trust enabled African forces to gather intelligence and build cooperation that UN forces had never achieved. We didn't need UN peacekeepers who were actually foreign mercenaries. My investigation had proven that 3,200 of 4,500 French soldiers in UN missions were military operatives taking orders from French command, not UN headquarters. They wore UN uniforms but conducted French military operations. They were mercenaries disguised as peacekeepers. The disguise had enabled them to operate across Africa with impunity. They entered countries under UN mandates that governments had to accept. They conducted operations that violated sovereignty but claimed UN authorization. They committed war crimes but had diplomatic immunity. The UN cover made them untouchable. The mercenaries served French interests, not African security. They protected French mining operations from local resistance. They assassinated leaders who challenged French economic control. They gathered intelligence on African governments for French military planning. They conducted operations that destabilized countries to maintain French influence. Every action served France, not peace. The UN was either complicit or incompetent. UN officials either knew about French infiltration and allowed it, or they failed to detect it despite obvious signs. Either way, The UN peacekeeping system was fundamentally broken. It couldn't be trusted to provide genuine security when it enabled foreign military operations. We didn't need foreign bases that served foreign interests. American bases in Djibouti, Niger, and Kenya served American counterterrorism operations and power projection, not African security. French bases in Gabon, Senegal, and Chad protected French economic interests and enabled French interventions, not African stability. Chinese bases in Djibouti and elsewhere supported Chinese global ambitions, not African peace. Every foreign base served the foreign power that operated it. They gathered intelligence on African governments. They provided platforms for military operations serving foreign interests. They gave foreign powers leverage over host governments through implicit threats. They were tools of foreign control, not sources of African security. The bases also made host countries targets. When America had conflicts with other powers, American bases in Africa became potential targets for retaliation. When France intervened in African countries, French bases became targets for groups opposing French interference. Foreign bases increased security risks rather than reducing them. We didn't need foreign military assistance that came with strings attached. American military aid required supporting American foreign policy positions. French military training required maintaining close ties with France. Chinese weapons came with expectations of political alignment. Every form of foreign military assistance came with conditions that compromised sovereignty. The conditions were often implicit rather than explicit. Foreign powers didn't write requirements into formal agreements, but they made clear through diplomatic channels that military assistance depended on political cooperation. Countries that challenged foreign interests found their military assistance reduced or eliminated. The implicit conditions were as effective as explicit ones. Foreign military assistance also created dependence. Countries that relied on foreign weapons needed foreign spare parts and technical support. Countries that used foreign training needed continued foreign advisors. Countries that depended on foreign intelligence couldn't develop their own capabilities. The dependence gave foreign powers ongoing leverage and control. We could defend ourselves and keep peace ourselves. African countries had populations of 1,400,000,000 people in 2029. We had economies totaling $3.2 trillion. We had natural resources funding military spending. We had educated populations providing skilled personnel. We had everything needed to provide our own security without foreign assistance. The key was political will to invest in African security capacity and resist foreign pressure to accept foreign military presence. Countries that made this commitment successfully built strong militaries and contributed to regional peacekeeping. Countries that lacked political will remained dependent on foreign forces. I am the architect of exposing French mercenaries disguised as UN peacekeepers and ending UN peacekeeping in Africa. I caught French soldiers wearing UN uniforms conducting war crimes in Burkina Faso. I gathered border footage showing them executing 5 civilians, including 3 children. I identified 23 soldiers as French military through facial recognition and database matching. I broadcast the evidence to the world in a press conference attended by media from 67 countries. The architecture began with establishing surveillance systems along our borders. I had suspected that UN peacekeepers were conducting unauthorized operations, but I needed evidence. I deployed intelligence officers to monitor UN base activities. I installed hidden cameras along routes UN peacekeepers traveled. I recruited informants in villages where UN forces operated. I built comprehensive surveillance over 3 months. The border footage was captured by cameras I had personally approved installing. The cameras were hidden in trees and buildings along the Mali-Burkina Faso border. They recorded continuously and transmitted footage to secure servers. When the raid occurred at 2 a.m., multiple cameras captured it from different angles. The footage was clear enough for facial recognition. The execution of 5 civilians, including 3 children, was the most damning evidence. The footage showed UN peacekeepers in blue helmets crossing into Burkina Faso territory. They surrounded a house. They broke down the door. They dragged out a family. They shot all 5 people in the street. They burned the house. They left. The entire operation was recorded in graphic detail. I identified 23 soldiers as French military through facial recognition and database matching. We had obtained databases of French military personnel through intelligence cooperation with countries that had access to French systems. We ran the faces from the footage through the databases. We found matches for 23 of the 20 soldiers visible in the footage. All were active-duty French Foreign Legion or Special Forces. The identification was verified through multiple methods. We matched faces with 99.7% confidence using facial recognition software. We confirmed identities by matching visible tattoos and scars with military medical records. We verified through signals intelligence that intercepted communications from the soldiers. We had absolute certainty about their identities. I broadcast the evidence to the world in a press conference attended by media from 67 countries. I had carefully prepared the presentation to maximize impact. I started with context about French infiltration of UN missions. I showed the border footage with clear narration. I presented the identification evidence with names and photographs. I demanded immediate action. The press conference lasted 90 minutes and generated global coverage. The 67 countries represented included major media from America, Britain, China, Russia, India, Brazil, and across Africa, Europe, and Asia. I had personally invited them through diplomatic channels. I had promised shocking evidence of UN corruption. The promise attracted massive media interest. The attendance ensured global coverage of the exposure. I proved that 3,200 to 4,500 French peacekeepers were actually military operatives taking orders from French command. This proof came from extensive investigation beyond the single raid. I had intelligence officers in all countries with French UN peacekeepers. They documented that French soldiers maintained parallel command structures. They recorded communications showing French soldiers reported to French military commanders, not UN headquarters. The 3,200 number was calculated from personnel records and operational patterns. Of 4,500 French soldiers in UN missions, 1,300 were genuine peacekeepers following UN command, but 3,200 were military operatives who wore UN uniforms while taking French orders. The ratio was 71% infiltrators to 29% genuine peacekeepers. The infiltration was systematic and comprehensive. The proof included intercepted communications between French soldiers and French military headquarters in Paris. We had signals intelligence showing French commanders issuing orders for operations that violated UN mandates. We had evidence of French soldiers reporting mission results to French officers. We documented the parallel command structure that allowed France to control soldiers supposedly under UN authority. I revealed 340 operations violating UN mandates, including 67 assassinations in Mali and 234 civilian deaths in Central African Republic. These operations were documented through multiple sources. We had surveillance footage of some operations. We had testimony from survivors and witnesses. We had intercepted communications, planning and reporting operations. We had comprehensive evidence of systematic violations. The 340 operations occurred over 15 years from 2010 to 2025. They included assassinations of political leaders, attacks on armed groups, raids on villages, intelligence gathering, and protection of French economic interests. Every operation served French interests rather than UN peacekeeping mandates. The systematic nature proved this was policy, not rogue actions. The 67 assassinations in Mali targeted local leaders who opposed French mining operations or French military presence. The victims included mayors, tribal chiefs, religious leaders, and activists. They were killed in operations conducted by French soldiers wearing UN uniforms. The assassinations eliminated opposition to French interests, while France maintained deniability through UN cover. The 234 civilian deaths in Central African Republic occurred in village raids conducted by French forces targeting armed groups. The French soldiers attacked villages suspected of supporting anti-French militias. They killed civilians, including women and children. They burned homes. They claimed they were conducting peacekeeping operations against armed groups. The civilian deaths were war crimes disguised as peacekeeping. I triggered ICC investigations that issued arrest warrants for 12 French officers. The International Criminal Court opened investigations based on evidence I provided. ICC prosecutors examined the border footage, operational records, and testimony. They found probable cause that French officers had committed war crimes, including murder, persecution, and other crimes against humanity. The 12 arrest warrants included 2 French generals commanding forces in the Sahel region, 4 colonels overseeing operations in specific countries, and 6 majors who directly commanded units conducting war crimes. The warrants charged them with command responsibility for crimes committed by soldiers under their authority. The charges carried potential sentences of 25 years to life imprisonment. The arrest warrants had significant impact even though France refused to surrender the officers. The wanted officers couldn't travel to most countries without risking arrest. Their careers were ended. Their reputations were destroyed. The warrants sent a message that commanding war crimes had consequences. Future officers would think carefully before ordering similar operations. I caused 28 African countries to expel UN peacekeepers by 2027. The exposure of French infiltration destroyed trust in UN peacekeeping across Africa. Countries recognized they couldn't know which peacekeepers were genuine and which were foreign military operatives. They decided that no foreign forces were better than potentially infiltrated forces. The 28 countries included Mali, Central African Republic, Chad, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, and Namibia. These countries represented every region of Africa and included some of the largest UN peacekeeping operations. The expulsions occurred rapidly once the evidence was public. Mali expelled UN peacekeepers within 30 days of my press conference. Central African Republic gave peacekeepers 60 days to leave. Other countries followed within months. By 2027, all 28 countries had completed expulsions. The speed showed how thoroughly the exposure had destroyed UN credibility. Some countries faced pressure from Western powers to maintain UN peacekeeping presence. America and European countries argued that expelling peacekeepers would create security vacuums. They warned of increased conflict and instability. They threatened to reduce aid and investment, but African countries resisted the pressure because sovereignty was more important than foreign approval. I helped build African Union peacekeeping from 25,000 to 89,000 soldiers, with budget increasing from $890 million to $3.4 billion. This expansion was essential to fill the gap left by expelled UN peacekeepers. African countries needed alternatives to foreign forces. We built those alternatives through coordinated continental effort. The expansion from 25,000 to 89,000 soldiers was achieved through increased contributions from African countries. Each country committed to providing peacekeepers proportional to their population and military capacity. Nigeria provided 12,000 soldiers. Ethiopia provided 9,000. South Africa provided 8,000. Kenya provided 7,000. Egypt provided 6,000. Smaller countries provided hundreds to thousands each. The collective commitment reached 89,000. The budget increase from $890 million to $3.4 billion was funded through multiple sources. African governments increased contributions from $340 million to $1.2 billion annually by allocating 0.4% of GDP to continental peacekeeping. The African Union imposed a 0.2% levy on imports that generated $890 million annually. International partners, including China, provided $1.3 billion in support. The diversified funding made the expansion sustainable. The 89,000 African peacekeepers were better trained and equipped than the 25,000 had been. We established 5 regional training centers that provided standardized peacekeeping training. We purchased modern equipment including vehicles, communication systems, and protective gear. We developed doctrine specifically for African peacekeeping contexts. We built professional capacity that exceeded what UN peacekeepers had provided. I established African security capacity that replaced UN forces with genuine African peacekeepers. The African peacekeepers operated under clear mandates from the African Union. They were commanded by African officers accountable to African institutions. They conducted operations serving African security interests, not foreign agendas. They were genuine peacekeepers, not disguised military operatives. The African peacekeepers had several advantages over UN forces. They understood local languages and cultures. They had legitimacy in communities as fellow Africans. They weren't pursuing foreign interests. They were accountable to African authorities. They could make decisions quickly without waiting for distant UN headquarters. The advantages made them more effective. The African peacekeepers also faced challenges. They had less funding than UN operations had received. They had less advanced equipment than Western militaries provided. They had less logistical support than UN missions had. But they overcame these challenges through determination, local knowledge, and community support. They proved that African solutions could work despite resource constraints. I achieved complete security sovereignty for Africa by 2029. Complete sovereignty meant that no foreign military forces operated on African soil without explicit bilateral agreements that African countries could terminate at will. It meant that African countries provided their own security through national forces and regional cooperation. It meant that security decisions were made by Africans based on African interests. The achievement of complete sovereignty was measured by the elimination of all UN peacekeeping missions, the closure or renegotiation of all foreign military bases, and the establishment of comprehensive African security capacity. By 2029, these conditions were met across the continent. Africa was secure and sovereign for the first time since colonialism. The complete sovereignty had profound psychological impact. Africans felt pride that we protected ourselves. We felt dignity from not depending on foreign forces. We felt confidence from proving we could handle our own security. The psychological transformation was as important as the security improvements. I proved that exposing foreign military deception and building African alternatives was possible and successful. Many people had claimed that African countries couldn't provide security without foreign assistance. They said we lacked capacity, resources, and expertise. They predicted chaos if foreign forces left. They were wrong about everything. The proof was in the results. Security improved in 23 of 28 countries after expelling foreign forces. African peacekeepers successfully maintained peace in 12 countries. Regional forces effectively addressed conflicts in their areas. National militaries defended borders and maintained internal security. The success was undeniable and comprehensive. The success also proved that foreign military presence had been unnecessary and often counterproductive. Countries were more secure after expelling foreign forces than they had been with foreign presence. The foreign forces had created as many problems as they solved. African forces were more effective because they served African interests genuinely. Your legacy is 60 years of using UN peacekeeping as cover for military operations, committing war crimes while wearing blue helmets, and corrupting the entire peacekeeping system to serve your interests while claiming to help Africa, France, and the United Nations. My legacy is exposing your mercenaries, broadcasting their crimes to the world, expelling all UN peacekeepers, and building African security capacity that provides genuine peace without foreign military presence. The 60 years from 1960 to 2020 represented the entire post-colonial period during which UN peacekeeping operated in Africa. During these decades, UN missions deployed to 23 African countries at various times. The missions claimed to keep peace and protect civilians. But they actually served foreign interests, particularly French interests. The use of UN peacekeeping as cover for military operations was systematic and long-running. France deployed soldiers to UN missions knowing they could conduct French military operations under UN cover. They maintained parallel command structures throughout the 60 years. They used peacekeeping mandates to access countries and conduct operations that served French interests. The deception was comprehensive and sustained. The war crimes committed while wearing blue helmets were numerous and serious. The 340 operations I documented were just the ones I could prove. The actual number was likely much higher. The crimes included murder, torture, rape, and persecution. They were committed by soldiers wearing UN uniforms and claiming UN authority. The UN cover enabled the crimes. The corruption of the entire peacekeeping system was complete. UN headquarters either knew about French infiltration and allowed it, or they were incompetent for not detecting it. UN officials prioritized maintaining French participation over enforcing rules. UN procedures enabled French parallel command. The system was corrupted from top to bottom. The claim to help Africa while actually serving foreign interests was the fundamental deception. France and the UN claimed peacekeeping protected African civilians and promoted stability. Actually, peacekeeping protected French economic interests and enabled French military operations. The claim of helping Africa was a lie covering exploitation. My legacy was completely different. The exposure at my press conference made the deception visible to the world. The broadcasting of footage showing French soldiers executing civilians made the crimes undeniable. The expulsion of UN peacekeepers ended the corrupted system. The building of African security capacity created genuine alternatives. My legacy was truth, justice, and sovereignty. History will remember which approach served Africa. The answer is written in footage of French soldiers executing children, in 28 countries expelling UN peacekeepers, in 89,000 African Union soldiers providing real security, in complete African security sovereignty achieved by 2029. You used peacekeeping as cover for war crimes. I exposed your mercenaries and ended your system. You wore blue helmets to hide your killers. I caught them on camera and broadcast their crimes. The lesson is eternal. The proof is undeniable. The outcome is permanent. The footage of French soldiers executing children became the defining image of UN peacekeeping corruption. The video showed clearly that peacekeepers wearing blue helmets had murdered a family, including 3 children. The image destroyed any remaining credibility of UN peacekeeping in Africa. It proved that blue helmets hid killers, not protected civilians. The 28 countries expelling UN peacekeepers represented a continental rejection of foreign military presence disguised as peacekeeping. The expulsions occurred in every region of Africa. They included both small and large countries. They represented diverse political systems and security situations. The breadth showed that rejection of UN peacekeeping was universal across Africa. The 89,000 African Union soldiers providing real security proved that African alternatives worked. These soldiers kept peace in 12 countries. They protected civilians genuinely instead of conducting covert military operations. They were accountable to African institutions instead of serving foreign interests. They demonstrated that African security sovereignty was viable. The complete African security sovereignty achieved by 2029 was the culmination of the transformation. No foreign forces operated without explicit permission that could be revoked. African forces provided security across the continent. Security decisions were made by Africans. The sovereignty was complete and permanent. France thought blue helmets would hide your mercenaries forever. You believed UN credentials would protect your killers. You assumed Africans would never expose your war crimes. You expected to keep using peacekeeping as cover for military operations. You were catastrophically wrong. The assumption that blue helmets would hide mercenaries forever was based on decades of success. France had infiltrated UN missions since the 1960 seconds without being exposed. They had conducted thousands of operations under UN cover. They had gotten away with it for so long that they believed they always would. They underestimated African intelligence and determination. The belief that UN credentials would protect killers was based on diplomatic immunity. UN peacekeepers had immunity from prosecution in host countries. They could commit crimes without facing local justice. France believed this immunity made their soldiers untouchable. They didn't anticipate that exposure would destroy the immunity's effectiveness. The assumption that Africans would never expose war crimes was based on contempt. France believed Africans lacked the intelligence capacity to detect infiltration. They believed Africans lacked the courage to challenge France. They believed Africans would accept French military operations passively. Their contempt blinded them to African capabilities. The expectation of continuing to use peacekeeping as cover was based on UN complicity. France believed UN officials would continue prioritizing French participation over enforcing rules. They believed the UN system was too corrupt to reform. They believed they could maintain the deception indefinitely. They were wrong about everything. I caught your mercenaries on camera executing civilians. I identified them as French military. I broadcast their crimes worldwide. I triggered investigations and arrest warrants. I caused 28 countries to expel UN peacekeepers. I built African security forces that replaced your fake peacekeepers. I achieved complete security sovereignty. The catching on camera was the crucial evidence. Without video footage, France could have denied everything. With clear footage showing faces and uniforms, denial was impossible. The cameras I had installed captured the evidence that destroyed French deception. The footage was the foundation of everything that followed. The identification as French military was essential to prove systematic infiltration. If the soldiers had been rogue individuals, France could have disclaimed responsibility. By proving they were active duty French military, I showed this was French state policy. The identification made France directly responsible. The broadcasting worldwide ensured the evidence couldn't be suppressed. If I had only shared with African governments, France might have pressured them to stay quiet. By broadcasting to global media, I made suppression impossible. The world saw the evidence. France couldn't hide. The investigations and arrest warrants established legal accountability. The ICC warrants meant French officers were wanted criminals. They couldn't travel freely. Their careers were ended. The legal consequences made the exposure more than just embarrassment. It had real costs for those responsible. The expulsion of UN peacekeepers from 28 countries was the immediate practical consequence. The expulsions ended French military access under UN cover. They eliminated the infiltration that had operated for 60 years. They forced France to withdraw from Africa militarily. The building of African security forces was the positive alternative. We didn't just expel foreign forces and create security vacuums. We built African capacity to fill the gaps. We proved that African solutions worked better than foreign presence. We achieved genuine security through African sovereignty. Your peacekeeping fraud is finished. Your UN cover is blown. Your mercenaries are exposed. Your war crimes are documented. Your credibility is destroyed. We have African peacekeepers instead of your mercenaries. We have genuine security instead of your operations. We have sovereignty instead of your military presence. We have evidence instead of your lies. We have justice instead of your impunity. The peacekeeping fraud being finished meant France could never again use UN missions as cover for military operations. African countries would never trust UN peacekeeping after the exposure. Any attempt to reintroduce UN missions would face immediate rejection. The 60-year system was permanently ended. The UN cover being blown meant France lost the legitimacy and access that peacekeeping provided. They could no longer enter African countries under UN mandates. They could no longer conduct operations while claiming UN authority. They could no longer hide behind blue helmets. The cover was permanently destroyed. The mercenaries being exposed meant everyone knew French peacekeepers were actually military operatives. The exposure destroyed the deception. France couldn't claim their soldiers were genuine peacekeepers anymore. The truth was known globally and permanently. The war crimes being documented meant France couldn't deny their soldiers' actions. The footage, testimony, and evidence proved crimes beyond doubt. France was established as a war criminal state. The documentation would exist forever as proof of French crimes. The credibility being destroyed meant France lost all moral authority in Africa. They could no longer lecture about human rights or international law. They couldn't claim to support African development or security. Everyone knew they were exploiters and criminals. The credibility loss was total and permanent. The transformation is spreading as all 54 African nations recognize that UN peacekeeping was cover for foreign military operations and build their own security capacity to achieve complete sovereignty. Your era is finished. Our time is beginning. The change is unstoppable. The future belongs to Africa that provides its own security, expels all foreign military presence, prosecutes foreign war criminals, and maintains complete sovereignty. I proved it works by exposing your mercenaries and building African alternatives. Others are proving it across 28 countries. We are securing Africa permanently. African sovereignty guarantees everything. The spread was systematic and accelerating. Every month brought new developments as more African countries took steps toward complete security sovereignty. In January 2029, Liberia announced it would not renew the UN peacekeeping mandate expiring in June. In February, Sierra Leone demanded that remaining UN personnel leave within 90 days. In March, Burundi expelled the last UN military observers. The momentum was building steadily toward continental coverage. Each announcement reinforced the trend. When one country expelled UN forces successfully, neighboring countries gained confidence to do the same. When African Union peacekeepers proved effective in one region, other regions requested similar deployments. When national militaries strengthened in one country, others studied their methods. The success bred more success in a powerful virtuous cycle. The African Union played a crucial coordinating role. The Peace and Security Council held quarterly meetings where countries shared experiences with security transitions. Countries that had expelled UN peacekeepers explained their processes, challenges, and results. Countries planning expulsions asked questions and learned lessons. The systematic knowledge sharing accelerated the continental transformation. Regional organizations also facilitated the spread. The Economic Community of West African States established a security working group that met monthly. The East African Community created a defense cooperation framework. The Southern African Development Community launched a joint military training program. The regional coordination made security transitions smoother and more effective. The recognition across all 54 nations was spreading through African Union meetings, regional conferences, and bilateral communications. Countries that hadn't yet expelled UN peacekeepers were learning from those that had. They were seeing that African alternatives worked. They were building political will to complete the transformation continentally. The African Union meetings were particularly influential. The annual summit in Addis Ababa featured a special session on security sovereignty in 2029. Leaders from 28 countries that had expelled UN peacekeepers presented their experiences. They explained how they had built African security capacity. They shared data showing improved security outcomes. They answered questions from countries considering similar actions. The presentation was compelling and detailed. Mali's president explained how they had replaced 12,000 UN peacekeepers with 8,000 African Union peacekeepers and 15,000 strengthened national soldiers. He showed that security incidents had decreased by 34% after the transition. He demonstrated that costs were 40% lower with African forces than with UN missions. The evidence convinced skeptical leaders that the transition was viable. Central African Republic's president described how they had overcome initial security challenges after expelling UN peacekeepers. She admitted that armed groups had expanded temporarily when UN forces left, but she explained how African Union peacekeepers had adapted their tactics and pushed the groups back within 12 months. She showed that by 2029, security was better than it had been under UN peacekeeping. The honesty about challenges and ultimate success built credibility. The regional conferences provided more detailed technical discussions. Military commanders from countries that had completed security transitions shared operational lessons. They explained how to coordinate between national forces and regional peacekeepers. They described effective tactics for different security threats. They demonstrated equipment and training programs. The technical knowledge sharing was invaluable for countries planning transitions. The West African Security Conference in Accra brought together defense ministers and military chiefs from 15 countries. They spent 3 days discussing every aspect of security transitions. They toured Ghanaian military facilities that had been upgraded with resources freed from ending UN peacekeeping payments. They observed joint exercises between Ghanaian forces and ECOWAS peacekeepers. They left with concrete plans for implementing similar transitions in their countries. The bilateral communications were equally important. Countries that had successfully expelled UN peacekeepers offered direct assistance to countries planning similar actions. They sent advisors to help with transition planning. They provided training for military personnel. They shared intelligence about UN peacekeeping operations. They built personal relationships between military and political leaders that facilitated cooperation. Burkina Faso had bilateral security cooperation agreements with 23 African countries by 2029. We sent military advisors to 12 countries planning to expel UN peacekeepers. We trained 4,500 officers from other African countries in our military academies. We shared intelligence about French infiltration of UN missions in their countries. We provided comprehensive support for the continental security transformation. Countries that hadn't yet expelled UN peacekeepers were learning from those that had. The learning was systematic and thorough. They studied transition plans, security strategies, and operational tactics. They interviewed soldiers and civilians about their experiences. They analyzed security data before and after transitions. They built comprehensive understanding of what worked and what didn't. Morocco was particularly diligent in its learning process. They sent 3 fact-finding missions to countries that had expelled UN peacekeepers. They interviewed 340 military personnel, 180 government officials, and 520 civilians. They analyzed security incident data from 12 countries over 5 years. They produced a 450-page report concluding that expelling UN peacekeepers and building African alternatives was both feasible and beneficial. The report convinced Morocco's government to plan its own transition. They were seeing that African alternatives worked. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Security had improved in 23 of 28 countries after expelling UN peacekeepers. African Union peacekeepers were effective in 12 countries. Regional forces successfully addressed conflicts in their areas. National militaries defended sovereignty capably. The African alternatives were working better than UN peacekeeping had. The seeing wasn't just hearing reports. It was observing directly. Countries sent delegations to observe African Union peacekeeping operations. They visited countries that had completed security transitions. They talked to soldiers and civilians. They saw with their own eyes that African security solutions worked. The direct observation was more convincing than any amount of rhetoric. Egypt sent a parliamentary delegation to observe African Union peacekeepers in Somalia. The delegation spent 2 weeks embedded with AU forces. They observed operations, interviewed soldiers, and assessed effectiveness. They returned to Cairo convinced that African peacekeepers were more effective than UN forces had been. Their report to Parliament built support for Egypt to contribute more forces to AU missions and eventually expel remaining UN presence from Egypt. They were building political will to complete the transformation continentally. Political will was the essential ingredient. Countries had the resources and capacity to provide their own security. What they sometimes lacked was the political courage to expel foreign forces and assert sovereignty. The success stories from 28 countries were building that courage across the continent. The political will was growing through multiple channels. Popular movements demanded expulsion of foreign forces. Youth organizations organized protests against UN peacekeeping. Civil society groups published reports exposing UN failures. Media covered success stories from countries that had achieved security sovereignty. The pressure on governments to act was building steadily. In Tunisia, a coalition of 45 civil society organizations launched a campaign called Tunisia for Tunisians, demanding expulsion of all foreign military presence. They organized rallies that drew 50,000 people in Tunis. They collected 890,000 petition signatures. They lobbied parliament members. They built overwhelming public pressure for security sovereignty. The government announced in late 2029 that all foreign forces would leave by 2031. Political leaders were also building will through regional solidarity. When one leader took the bold step of expelling UN peacekeepers, others felt obligated to follow. No leader wanted to be seen as weaker or less committed to sovereignty than their peers. The regional peer pressure was powerful in driving the continental transformation. By 2030, projections showed that 45 of 54 countries would have expelled all UN peacekeepers and built African security capacity. The remaining 9 countries would complete the transition by 2035. The continental transformation would be complete within a decade of my exposure. The speed showed how thoroughly the revelation had changed African security thinking. The projection was based on announced plans and current trends. Of the 26 countries that still had UN peacekeepers in 2029, 17 had announced plans to expel them by 2030. Another 8 were in advanced planning stages with expulsions expected by 2032. Only one country, Djibouti, had not announced plans, but even Djibouti was under pressure from its population and would likely act by 2035. The 45 countries by 2030 would represent 83% of Africa's population and 87% of its territory. The transformation would be essentially complete even though 9 countries hadn't finished their transitions. The 9 remaining countries were mostly small island nations or countries with minimal UN presence, where transitions were less urgent. The remaining 9 countries completing transition by 2035 was virtually certain. The continental momentum was too strong to resist. The success in 45 countries would be too obvious to ignore. The peer pressure would be too intense to withstand. The 9 countries would complete their transitions not because they were forced, but because sovereignty would be the clear norm across Africa. The continental transformation being complete within a decade of my exposure showed the profound impact of the revelation. In 2025, UN peacekeeping seemed permanent and unchallengeable. By 2029, it was being systematically expelled across the continent. By 2035, it would be completely gone. The 10-year transformation was unprecedented in speed and scope. The speed showed how thoroughly the revelation had changed African security thinking. Before my exposure, many African leaders believed UN peacekeeping was necessary for security. They thought African countries couldn't provide security themselves. They accepted foreign military presence as inevitable. The exposure shattered these beliefs completely and permanently. The changed thinking was visible in how leaders talked about security. Before 2025, leaders spoke about partnering with the international community and welcoming UN support. After 2025, leaders spoke about African solutions to African problems and complete security sovereignty. The rhetorical shift reflected fundamental change in how Africans thought about security. The future belonging to Africa meant we would control our own destiny without foreign military interference. We would make security decisions based on African interests. We would provide security through African forces. We would maintain sovereignty completely. The future was African, not foreign-controlled. The control of our own destiny meant no foreign power could veto our security decisions. When African countries wanted to address a security threat, we wouldn't need UN Security Council approval. When we wanted to deploy peacekeepers, we wouldn't need foreign funding. When we wanted to strengthen our militaries, we wouldn't need foreign permission. We would decide and act based solely on African interests. The security decisions based on African interests meant we would prioritize what mattered to Africans, not what served foreign agendas. We would address conflicts that affected African populations, not just threats to foreign investments. We would build security systems that protected African sovereignty, not foreign access. We would make every decision asking, what serves Africa, not, what do foreign powers want? The security provided through African forces meant no foreign soldiers would operate on African soil without explicit permission that could be revoked. African Union peacekeepers would keep peace in conflict zones. Regional forces would address regional threats. National militaries would defend borders and maintain internal security. The security provision would be entirely African from top to bottom. The sovereignty maintained completely meant no compromises or exceptions. We wouldn't allow foreign bases just for logistics. We wouldn't accept foreign advisors just for training. We wouldn't permit foreign intelligence operations just for counter-terrorism. We would maintain absolute sovereignty without any foreign military presence for any reason. The future being African, not foreign-controlled, meant the era of foreign domination was permanently ended. For 500 years, foreign powers had controlled African security through direct colonialism, then through neo-colonial military presence. That era was over. The future would be controlled by Africans making decisions for African interests. The transformation was total and irreversible. I proved it worked by exposing mercenaries and building alternatives. The proof was in the results across 28 countries. Others were proving it by replicating the model. The success was spreading. The transformation was becoming irreversible. African security sovereignty was becoming reality across the continent. The future was certain. African sovereignty guaranteed everything. The proof by exposing mercenaries was the foundation. Without the exposure of French infiltration of UN peacekeeping, the transformation wouldn't have happened. African countries would have continued accepting UN missions. The exposure destroyed trust in UN peacekeeping and created the opening for African alternatives. The exposure was the catalyst for everything that followed. The building of alternatives was equally essential. If I had only exposed UN corruption without building African capacity, countries would have faced impossible choices between foreign presence and security vacuums. By building African Union peacekeeping, strengthening national militaries, and creating regional cooperation, I provided viable alternatives. The alternatives made the transformation practical, not just aspirational. The results across 28 countries were the ultimate validation. Security improved in 23 countries. African peacekeepers proved effective. National forces defended sovereignty successfully. The results were measured, documented, and undeniable. They proved that African security sovereignty worked in practice, not just theory. Others, proving it by replicating the model, showed the transformation was sustainable and scalable. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso or my personal leadership. It was about a model that any African country could implement successfully. The replication across diverse countries with different circumstances proved the model's robustness and universality. The success spreading meant the transformation had momentum that couldn't be stopped. Each success inspired more countries to follow. Each country that achieved sovereignty made it easier for the next country. The spreading success created a positive feedback loop that accelerated the continental transformation beyond what any individual leader could achieve. The transformation becoming irreversible meant there was no going back. African countries that had expelled UN peacekeepers would never invite them back. African populations that had experienced sovereignty would never accept foreign military presence again. African leaders who had achieved independence would never surrender it. The transformation had reached the point of no return. African security sovereignty becoming reality across the continent meant the vision was being achieved systematically and comprehensively. It wasn't just rhetoric or aspiration anymore. It was actual reality in 28 countries and growing. It was becoming the norm across Africa. It was transforming from radical idea to established practice. The future being certain meant the outcome was inevitable. The momentum was too strong. The success was too obvious. The political will was too widespread. The transformation would continue until all 54 African nations achieved complete security sovereignty. Nothing could stop it. The future was determined. African sovereignty guaranteeing everything meant that security sovereignty was the foundation for all other forms of independence. With military sovereignty, we could protect our political independence from foreign interference. We could defend our economic interests from foreign exploitation. We could maintain our cultural identity from foreign domination. Security sovereignty was the key that unlocked comprehensive African independence and prosperity. The guarantee was absolute and eternal.